welcome. Let me turn down volume from the music. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Welcome back to another session, live reading session for The People's Guide to Capitalism by Hadas Thier. Hadas Thier. So today we will read the third chapter. I was actually watching the David Harvey's class presentation, live reading as well, I think. Well, it was not a live reading, it was more like a class around Marx Capital. And he said that chapter 3, or not chapter 3, I don't think it was chapter, no, yeah, it is chapter 3 actually, which is money in Capital specifically, was the most dense, and like the chapter where people start to reading it and then they just stop and get uninterested, because it's just very dense. I think I can confirm that. I tried reading it as well, couple times actually. I did read it, but it definitely is not a very accessible chapter in general. And yeah, it made sense to me. I think in that video, if you joined the Discord, I think I shared it on the Discord, and if not, then yeah, no, you know what? I think it's on the YouTube video from the last week's live reading. Anyways, and he said something along the lines of, Marx had a few different styles of writing, and yeah, it was the analytic. I think it was analytical writing style, and then a couple of others. But anyways, yeah, so it was good. Yeah, so let me drink small sip. I'll be on Mexico City actually tomorrow. I will be joining Ernesto and another friend of the show in these talks. I don't know what's the definition for colloquio. Let me see. Colloquio in English. Colloquy? Colloquy? I don't know. That sounds. Yeah. It's like an academic conference of critical theory. And yeah, pretty excited. I am from Mexico City actually. I don't really visit that often, at least not as much as I used to when I was with my family. But definitely a super cool city. Highly gentrified, especially in a couple of places in Roma Norte, or in general, the Colonia Roma is pretty gentrified, and also the Colonia Condesa. So if you are planning to live in Mexico City, don't, because there's a lot of sentiment towards, negative sentiment towards especially American tourists, and I think it's pretty understandable, honestly. Like, the sole presence of people with, that pay in dollars and speak English and do not, they resist in speaking Spanish or learning the language, um, is an issue a lot of times because, restaurants mainly, and local businesses, they are, compliant to whatever the tourist wants. So that sometimes has negative consequences in terms of like salsas, for example, which I love, absolutely love spicy salsas, are basically getting extinct in these places because just tourists don't can't can, like can't they don't they're unable to enjoy spicy salsas and spicy you know food in general, which sucks a lot. That definitely takes a toll. um, it brings my hatred for gentrifiers even more, and landlords. Jesus, I know that there are cases where people get expelled almost like pretty harshly because suddenly their landlord says, you know what, I'm gonna start like next month, I'm gonna start a charge in dollars and I'm gonna charge like 3 times what you're paying for because, you know, there's this tourist that says that he wants to live here and he's able to pay me 3 times the amount that you pay for me. So I'm just gonna go with that and suck it up. So basically, yeah, just don't come to Mexico if it is not for a few days at most. Please, appreciate it. Love you. All right, so I think we can begin. Last time we read about labor theory of value, and we read, uh, how is how are commodities made? What is the concept of commodity? And how are commodities made? Uh, and where does the value of things come from, right? And we concluded, in a most part, that it comes from the labor of people, whether it be uh, live labor or dead labor. In dead labor, if you remember, it was about the materials that are already processed and reused into creating something else entirely, right? Which is would be for example an iPhone. Um, the it has a lot of dead labor because there are certain components of the iPhone that have to be created elsewhere or from other places, and they have to be imported, produced separately, and then once you produce that, then you send it to the whoever place puts it together and gives you the iPhone, right? So like a lot of electronic components are being imported from different places, and they together make something else entirely, right? So that is dead labor. So yeah, well, we'll begin with chapter 3, money, and she again starts quoting Capital, and it reads, "We see then that commodities are in love with money, but that the course of true love never did run smooth." The subchapter's name is "The Man Behind the Curtain." "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain," said a frizzled old man standing by a console of levers. Behind the smoke and flames of the towering, disembodied head of the famed Wizard of Oz stood an ordinary, unremarkable old man. Such, too, is the story of money. Its mysterious power determines the laws by which we live. Yet behind its frightening mystique is a simple man made solution to the demands of a market based system of trade. Pieces of paper, parenthesis, or computerized electronic bits in our bank accounts, representing currency, seem to have limitless control over our lives. Whether you have it and how much of it you have determines whether you eat or go hungry, whether you're entitled to the finest healthcare money can buy, or are left bleeding to death at the hospital's door, whether your children will be treated to an elite educational facility or patted down routinely by the cops for living in a high crime neighborhood, whether you are politically connected and even taken care of in the halls of Washington, or whether you have to fight to even have your vote be counted. Money is so woven into the fabric of our daily lives that we rarely stop to wonder how it got to be that these pieces of paper have come to dominate our lives. Every day it slips in and out of our hands. Every time we get on the train to work or fill up our car with gas, stop for a sandwich, pay the electric bill to keep the lights on and the internet running, get an item of clothing or a piece of furniture. Each of these things is procured by money. It seems as natural as the air we breathe. Marx took great pains to break down the processes and logic underlying the physical appearance of money. Money, or the money form, as Marx explained, is simply a particular physical format representing the development of value in market-based societies. It is a universal measure against which all the commodities reflect their value. As we said at the end of the last chapter, we can count the worth of a pen and a life savers as 10 cents, instead of saying that they both embody an equal amount of labor time. Having a universal measure of value is critical to any society that depends on trade and exchange. Even relatively simple barter economies Imagine a marketplace in which the bearers of each commodity, a furniture maker, a baker, and other producers, have to determine the value of their commodity relative to every other commodity in the market. This would lead to a dizzying number of equations. Enter money. Rather than saying that your chair is worth 10 times as much as a loaf of bread, and 100 times as much as a ballpoint pen, and a quarter of an iPhone case, ad infinitum, it is much easier to say that it is worth $10. If all other commodities are measured this way, the ratio with which they exchange with each other will be easily determined. And if those $10 can easily fit in your bag and be spent wherever you see fit, this eases the entire process. Mainstream economics assume that money determines the values of commodities, and that somehow, through its own power, money creates circulation and exchange. But as Marx argued, the relationship is in reverse. The existence of money is determined by the value, which are congealed units of socially necessary labor time, of commodities. Because all commodities have values embodied within them, they can be measured against each other and given a price tag with money. It is not that money renders, and she starts to quote, renders commodities commensurable. Quite the contrary. Because all commodities as values are objectified human labor and therefore in themselves commensurable, their values can be communicably measured in one and the same specific commodity, and this commodity can be converted into the common measure of their values, that is, into money. Money as a measure of value is the necessary form of appearance of the measure of value, which is immanent in commodities, namely labor time. In fact, money plays several simultaneous roles. Within the circulation process, as we've discussed, it measures and reflects the values of commodities by providing a price tag. It then eases the process of circulation of those commodities by functioning as a convenient and easily portable medium of exchange. Finally, money can also be removed from the circulation process to serve as a store of value over time. How did money come to play these roles? This is a problem of both history and logic. To understand the logic of money, to unveil the man behind the curtain, it is useful to follow Marx in a brief, albeit somewhat abstract, detour through the pages of Capital. Following this theoretical illustration, we will then outline a brief history of how money concretely developed over time along with capitalism. Finally, once these foundations are in place, we'll return to the question of the relationship between value, money, and price. A universal equivalent. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx introduced the equation, quote, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, end of quote. This equation was not meant to describe a concrete or historical reality, though it's possible that at some point in some place one could trade 20 yards of linen for a coat. Instead, quote, 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat served as a launching point for Marx to take us from point A to point B to point C on a theoretical exposition which ended with an understanding of the role of money. At face value, the meaning of this equation is self-evident. The amount of socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce 20 yards of linen is equal to the amount of socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce 1 coat. But Marx picked apart this seemingly simple equation by distinguishing between the two poles of this equation. The 20 yards of linen, he explained, is the relative value, and the coat is its equivalent value. By relative value, Marx meant that the linen's value is the one being determined. It is the active part of the equation. The relative value asks the question, how valuable, relatively speaking, is 20 yards of linen? The equivalent value, on the other hand, is simply an item of equivalent value to the linen. It plays a passive part of the equation, a marker of how much value is embodied in 20 yards of linen. The coat does not have an independent role. It only reflects the value that it is embodied in the linen. The equivalent value answers the question, how valuable is 20 yards of linen? With the answer, it holds 1 coat's worth of value. As Marx explained, the relative and equivalent forms are two inseparable moments, which belong to and mutually condition each other. It does us no good to say that 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen. The relative value of linen can only be expressed in another commodity's equivalent value. Now, if the maker of linen wants to trade her linen for tea, she'll need to measure the relative value of her linen by the measurement of tea. She may find that her 20 yards of linen is also equivalent to 10 pounds of tea. So in this case, the tea becomes the equivalent or the measure of the linen's value. If the linen maker wanted to trade her linen for sandals, she may find that 20 yards finds its equivalent in 2 pairs of shoes. The linen, explained Marx, by virtue of the form of value, no longer stands in a social relation with merely one other kind of commodity, but with the whole world of commodities as well. As a commodity, it is a citizen of that world. At the same time, the endless series of expressions of its value implies that, from the point of view of the value of the commodity, the particular form of use value in which it appears, which is its equivalent value, is a matter of indifference. What Marx is saying is that the specifics of whether linen's value is being measured against tea or sandals or coats doesn't matter. What matters is the amount of abstract labor objectified in each. These items lose their subjectivity as they become simple units of measurements of the value of linen. They can become equivalents only because they, like linen, embody human labor in the form of value, which are commodities. Despite the coat's button-up appearance, the linen recognizes in it a splendid kindred soul, the soul of value. As markets develop, the limitations of these equations become self-evident. Whereas societies that only bartered specific products could do so in accordance with ritual or traditional procedures, generalized exchange and commerce require a great number of such equivalent relationships. As Ernest Mandel explained, the relations of equivalence concern no longer just two products or two categories of products, but an infinite variety of different goods. It is no longer the labor time of the potter that is compared with that of the agriculturist. 10, 20, 30 different crafts have to compare their respective productive efforts from time to time. In order that these exchanges may go on without interruption, the owners of the commodities must be able to get rid of their goods before they have had the luck to encounter purchasers who possess the products they themselves want to obtain in exchange for these goods. Imagine going to the mall to procure a cookbook. You have 40 pounds of tea with you, and you go up to the owner of the bookstore and pull out a sheet of endless equations. Quote, well, I see here that my 20 pounds of tea are equal to 80 yards of linen, or 4 coats, or 8 pairs of shoes, or blah, blah, blah. And scroll down until you find, it's equal to 2 books. And then the bookseller has to confirm with her sheet of endless equations, well, I see that my book is equal to such and such and such. Oh, and 20 pounds of tea. The problem, Marx argued, is 1, that the equation is incomplete because the series of its representations never comes to an end, that it is a, quote, motley mosaic of disparate and unconnected expressions of value, and that 3, each commodity will have its own endless series of expressions of value which are all different from the relative form of value of every other commodity. So, The solution to this inefficient and incomplete set of equations is to flip the equation around. So now it would read 1 coat or 10 pounds of tea or 2 shoes and so on are all equal to 20 yards of linen. Now, linen becomes not only the equivalent part of the equation, but becomes a universal equivalent against which all commodities are measured. So, no matter which store I go, every store owner sells their commodities on the basis of how many yards of linen they're worth. Which is basically, she's explaining here, as Marx was explaining as well, that it's like linen, if linen was, the currency, or the gold, gold standard, I guess. I'm not much of an economist myself, but yeah. So people would need to find something that could equate the value or try to universalize the value so that no matter where they are, what product they're selling, they would always have a reference to the amount of socially necessary labor that comprised in yards of linen, basically. This equation imposes the character of universal equivalent on the linen, which is the commodity excluded as equivalent from the whole world of commodities. The linen becomes the bearer of abstract, undifferentiated human labor. Again, Marx wasn't making a historical point here about linen's role in the market. He was demonstrating how any single commodity, whether it be linen, cigarettes, cattle, or silver, could be assigned to such a role. If we now replace linen with gold, and eventually gold with paper bills, the absurdity and mystique of money is uncovered. Marx wrote, "If I state that coats or boots stand in relation to linen because the latter is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, the absurdity of statement is self-evident. Nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots bring these commodities into relation with linen, or with gold, or with silver, and this makes no difference here, as a universal equivalent, the relations between their own private labor and the collective labor of society appears to them in exactly this absurd form." So basically, as I understand it, this just neutralizes the possibility of analyzing further into what is the actual value and how this value come to be in the commodities made, right? Because then you're just equating something to a sheet of paper that says whatever amount you want it to say, and you can say that, hey, you know what, this thing that is 30,000 pesos, which is like $1,500, $1,600, is exactly that, right? Is not equal to the amount of socially necessary labor time to produce this, but rather the amount of papers that have little numbers that sum up the equal value to this thing. So, okay, the role of universal equivalent has, in fact, been filled by different commodities over time. At the dawn of petty commodity production, the first universal equivalents were often those goods that were most commonly exchanged and were either of fundamental importance to the economies, like food and tools, or were ornaments frequently used. Eventually, as we see below, the role came to be played most significantly by gold, as economics professor Doug Orr explained in an article for Dollars and Cents magazine. The things that get used as money may have changed over time, and modern people often chuckle when they hear about some of them. The Romans used salt, from which they get the word salary. South Sea Islanders used shark's teeth, and several societies actually used cows. The three wise men brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh, each of which was money in different regions at the time. If money does not exist or is in short supply, it will be created. In POW camps, where guards specifically outlaw its existence, prisoners use cigarettes instead. In the American colonies, the British attempted to limit the supply of British pounds because they knew that by limiting the supply of money, they could hamper the development of independent markets in the colonies. To overcome this problem, the colonists began to use tobacco leaves as money. So I will. We're now switching to sweating money, which is next subchapter, and I will take a small amount of time to post the Discord in the chat just so you guys can join. There it is. That's the Discord. And I will share again the stream. In other chats as well. And yeah, cool. Now, continuing with sweating money. The capacity for value to be objectified within a physical entity of money allows for the process of circulation to take place with ease. Yet, certain physical characteristics make some forms of money more or less suitable to grease the wheels of exchange. The more that commerce developed in scale, eventually extended into a world market, the greater became the need for a stable and transferable currency. Metal coins came to supplant other forms, like cattle, because they were more practical to carry around, they didn't age and die, and they could be made relatively uniformly. They could also be easily split into discrete quantities. Exchanging half or a quarter of a cow is considerably more difficult than dividing up 10 gold coins into two groups of 5. Precious metals thus establish themselves over time as universal equivalents for exactly those reasons. Certain qualities were found out to be more suitable for the job by merchants and administrators. As Mandel outlined, their high specific weight enables them to concentrate in a modest volume a quantity of metal representing a fairly large exchange value, thus deeming them transportable. They are also durable. Owing to their resistance to wear and tear, rust, etc., metals are divisible, and fragments can be easily melted down into larger units. Lastly, they need to be recognizable, easy to replicate into known qualities, but simultaneously guarding against counterfeiting through detection of differing weights. These physical attributes make some metals more practical than others. Gold, for instance, doesn't oxidize under normal pressures and temperatures, which means it will not deteriorate in the way that silver or copper or other metals do. The malleability of gold also makes it easy to turn coins into bars or jewelry, thus physically adding or subtracting from the money supply. By easing circulation, money is thus able to appear, disappear, and reappear again in every exchange. Direct exchange of goods, share for bread, means that one item is replaced by another. In order to get bread, I have to get rid of my chair, and then both items are used or consumed by their buyers. Yet money does not vanish through circulation. Instead, it continually passes from hand to hand. It always leaves behind a precipitate at a point in the arena of circulation vacated by the commodities. When one commodity replaces another, the money commodity always sticks to the hands of some third person. Circulation sweats money from every pore. From its throne as a universal equivalent, money displaces personal or social relations. Cash is inherently impersonal. It sits in a cash register. Where did it come from? What did it buy? You don't need to know the person, source of, or where will it go. You can buy a ping pong table, some diapers, and baby formula, or this book from a guy named Jeff Bezos, whom you have never met, but he happens to own Amazon.com and conducts business deals with you on the regular. Behind Jeff are over 2 million suppliers of goods, and behind them millions of low-paid factory, warehouse, and transportation workers, as well as salespeople whose names you will never know. Items for sale also lose their subjectivity as they are reduced to a single number, their price. The circulation of commodities differs from the direct exchange of products, argued Marx, not only in form but in its essence. We have only to consider the course of events. Describing the anonymity and boundlessness of this circulation, he wrote, "The weaver has undoubtedly exchanged his linen for a Bible, his own commodity for someone else's. But this phenomenon is only true for him. The Bible pusher, who prefers a warming drink to cold sheets, had no intention of exchanging linen for his Bible. The weaver did not know that wheat had been exchanged for his line. B's commodity replaces that of A, but A and B do not mutually exchange their commodities. It may in fact happen that A and B buy from each other, but a particular relationship of this kind is by no means the necessary result of the general conditions of the circulation of commodities. We see here on one hand how the exchange of commodities breaks through all the individual and local limitations of the direct exchange of products and develops the metabolic processes of human labor. On one hand, there develops a whole network of social connections of natural origin, entirely beyond the control of the human agents." Quick water break. Quote, "A store of value." Lastly, as Marx's above example may also imply, money can store value over time. Where the were the Bible pusher to sell his Bible on Monday, but want to wait till Friday to purchase brandy, the intermediary of cash could be used to hold his earnings until he's ready to spend them. This solves the problem of a coincidence of wants, of a barter economy, as classical economists dubbed it. I may have a chair to sell today, but I can find a person who wants a chair and at the same time has exactly the equivalent amount of bread to exchange it with. But can I find? Yeah, that was a question. Even worse, my chair may be worth 10 loaves of bread, but I only need 2 and on different days of the week. Instead of each producer and buyer on the market bringing out all their goods and finding a simultaneous and comparable exchange to meet their needs, trading goods for money allows the seller to use that money when and how they please. So I can sell my chair, or more likely today, my labor power, on Friday for $30. I may then get a pint to celebrate at the end of the week for $7 at the end of the day. The following Monday and Wednesday, I'll spend $6 for 2 loaves of bread and put the rest away to pay my rent at the end of the month. This simplistic example is meant to highlight a broader point. An artisanal feudal market could perhaps operate several times a year for people to gather and swap their goods. But a market economy made up of an infinite amount of mass-produced goods must function with the speed and fluidity that can only be facilitated by money. The convenience of cash clearly suits the modern capitalists as well. A coffee shop may sell enough drinks to generate a few $1,000s a day. This capital can be put away and used in part for the payroll on Friday, while the rest is saved for a mass expenditure at the end of the year for the newest line of cappuccino maker. Conversely, an agricultural company that sells wheat harvests their crops at the beginning of summer, but will have expenses all year round. Meanwhile, hotels make their biggest returns during tourist seasons and so need to hold on to the revenue in order to pay their bills during off seasons. Money can also be a means to preserve wealth during recessions. This is a more complicated question, which we'll take up later on. But in a nutshell, you can see how capitalists would want to hold on to their wealth rather than invest it in the new production, if they see no potential for profitable investments. In a sense, this is the same idea, but on a larger scale, of a hotel holding on its savings through an off-season. But rather than to ensure that the system continues to function uninterrupted by on and off seasons, withholding investment during a recession achieves the opposite effect, a further breakdown of the economy. A glittering incarnation. The role that gold played as the dominant currency or universal equivalent for much of capitalist economic history is implied by the mainstream economists to be its natural function. The precious metal's worth is assumed to be as intrinsic to its physicality as the colors of its shine. The French postmodernist Michel Foucault philosophized, "The signs of exchange, because they satisfy desire, are sustained by the dark, dangerous, and accursed glitter of metal. An equivocal glitter, for it reproduces in the depths of the earth that other glitter that sings at the far end of the night. It resides there like an inverted promise of happiness. And because metal resembles the stars, The knowledge of all these perilous treasures is at the same time knowledge of the world. A contemporary, albeit less poetic, internet explanation from onlygold.com is a typical illustration of the same principle. Quote, humans almost intuitively place a high value on gold, equating it with power, beauty, and the cultural elite. And since gold is widely distributed all over the globe, we find this same thinking about gold throughout ancient and modern civilizations everywhere. End of quote. It seems as though humans all over the world, easily impressed by shining metal, spontaneously attached great value to gold. If this were indeed the case, we are hard pressed to explain why humans seem to be as easily impressed by decidedly unshiny green bills of paper currency. In reality, while gold itself is a commodity and has always carried on its own value, equal to the socially necessary labor time required to find, mine, and smelt it, its Wizard of Oz like power grew out of its role as the accepted and universal equivalent. As discussed above, there is a long history of other commodities serving that same role. Thus, for thousands of years, gold was used alongside many other commodities and types of metallic coins. From ancient Egypt to the Greek and Roman Empire, up until the development of modern capitalism in Western Europe in the 6th century. Yet by the end of the 19th century, gold had become the preeminent universal equivalent. Countries around the world had developed their own systems and currencies, but the need for a universal equivalent that could be used across countries grew as capitalism became a worldwide system, a global system under a gold standard whereby local economic units such as the British pound could be fixed and convertible to weights of gold, took centuries to unfold. Ultimately, its predominance followed the hegemony of Britain as a world power, financially and militarily. As historian Pierre Vilar explained, if late 17th century England laid the basis for what was to become the world monetary system, the gold standard and banknotes, this can only be understood in terms of the establishment of England's power, especially her international and maritime power, which was then taking place. British power grew in strength from the 16th to the 18th centuries, based on its advancing industrial development and massive upheaval of agrarian relations, the enclosure movements discussed in Chapter 1. Among the most powerful arms that the state used to establish monetary order was the Bank of England, founded in 1694. The Bank of England issued banknotes as receipts for gold deposits, just as gold merchants had issued running cash notes for similar purpose. But the bank's notes became authoritative and eventually accepted and encouraged by merchants as payments to circulate in the economy. By 1773, the consolidation of the Bank of England's authority was evidenced by the introduction of the death penalty for anyone caught forging its banknotes. In the early 19th century, this system of pegging currency to the central bank's gold reserves became an official gold standard. Each coin or bank-issued bill was worth a certain amount of gold, which could then be redeemed by its courier from the Bank of England at any point. The value of gold, in turn, reflected the labor time necessary to produce it as a commodity, fluctuations of supply, where and in what quantity it would be found, and demand, determined by the economy's needs of production and circulation of goods. By the late 19th century, most countries tied their currencies to gold. For the decades that it operated, it provided a relatively stable price system, in which currencies were all fixed against the same measurements, and all accounts across any border could be settled in gold. The gold standard eventually crumbled under the pressure of the Great Depression and transformed itself for the needs of a new world order. After World War II, it was resuscitated in a different form. Allied nations met through the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference and agreed to a system that became known as the Bretton Woods Agreement. Bretton Woods set up the International Monetary Fund and required all currencies to be tied to the US dollar at a fixed rate of exchange. The dollar, in turn, was pegged to gold. The post-war system now affirmed and strengthened the actuality of the United States' preeminent economic and political position in the world. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, for decades since has served as an instrument to serve the needs of the US ruling class. Meanwhile, the monetary system solidified the US dollar as the world's premier currency, used for conduct of all international trade. The dollar-centered system still relied on gold as the underlying value behind it, since the US was obligated to redeem any foreign reserves of dollars for gold. Thus, Marx's description of contemporary capitalism remained apt for over a century in one form or another. Modern society, he wrote, which has already in its infancy pulled Pluto by the hair of his head from the bowels of the earth, greets gold as its holy grail, as the glittering incarnation of its innermost principle of life. Quick water break. Let me know if you're liking the reading so far, or if you're interested in other books that we could also add to the list. Feel free to do so as well. We appreciate feedback a lot. Okay. Continuing the reading. From glittering gold to imagined electronic bits. Gold, as we've discussed, was a convenient currency for the purpose of measuring value, easing circulation, and storing wealth. It could be easily melted, formed, measured, and carried. But it reached two limits. First, though its supply could be relatively guaranteed in the long run, in the short term, gold's supply, and therefore its price, was susceptible to wild swings brought on by gold rushes, such as the discovery of gold in California and Australia in the mid-19th century, or dried reserves, such as the decrease in mining of Brazilian gold due to the struggles for independence in the region. Second, at points of economic crises of war, the need for greater money supplies and credit required surpassing the bounds of gold in supply. In practice, governments abandoned the gold standard whether they deemed it necessary. The US did so at the onset of the Civil War, again during World War I, when governments around the world inflated their economies to finance the war, and again in response to the Great Depression. In each of these cases, states' abilities to fund wars, stimulate investment, and generally regulate the needs of the economy trumped any formal adherence to pegging currency to gold. The gold standard was finally discarded in 1971, based on the changing needs of the US ruling class. The weakening of the United States' economic position relative to the other world's economies at the time meant that America's trade partners were purchasing less American goods and accumulating dollars that they did not need. Foreign financial institutions were cashing their dollars for gold, and so, facing a swelling outflow of gold, which the US Treasury could neither stem nor satisfy, Then President Richard Nixon announced the breaking of dollar to gold convertibility. Paper money and global currencies thus became delinked from the traditional commodity money form, which had dominated the capitalist economy until that point. Paper bills had functioned as certificates that represented ownership of gold held by banks or the Federal Reserve. And that gold was itself a commodity, which held value. Since the end of the gold standard, money became more complex and intangible, representing value in its own right, though it is made up of no particular substance with no intrinsic worth. Its effectiveness as a means of payment is dependent on state enforced standards. Gold's value as a commodity reflected the socially necessary labor time required for extracting and processing the metal. Previous commodity forms of money, whether they were linen, oxen, or silver, could similarly measure their value through the labor time required to produce them. Today's paper money, in contrast, is not a commodity. If its value was measured by necessary labor time, money would indeed be very cheap, as it is rather effortless to produce. And a $1 bill would be worth the same as $100 bill. Paper currencies' values are in fact abstracted, based on an agreed upon faith we hold in their role as representatives of value. This is even more the case today, as physical cash makes up a very small percentage of circulating money in our society. Money is another step removed from physical currency, residing as electronic data in banks' computers. As one radical economics textbook points out, with modern electronic banking, deposits can quietly change hands without ever touching hands. Cash and electronic bits are certainly less tangible than gold. Nevertheless, their origin and the role of money as a universal equivalent to measure, circulate, and store value remains the same. How easily and to what extent society can attach value to any currency system has recently been tested by the rise and fall and rise, etc., of bitcoins. Then we have a sidebar that explains what's in a Bitcoin. So give me 1 second. I'm almost out of water, but luckily I have another bottle right here, so I came prepared. Great. So what's in a Bitcoin? Bitcoin, the largest and best known digital currency, was designed and created by an anonymous programmer, or possibly group of programmers, named, and I'm sure you chat know it, Satoshi Nakamoto, and released in 2009. Its aim was to mediate online transactions without financial intermediaries such as banks and without direction from any single state. Bitcoin is known as cryptocurrency because it uses a blockchain technology, which is essentially a virtual ledger of all transactions. The technology behind Bitcoin is beyond the scope of this discussion, but its outcome is that it can provide reliable, secure transactions without a central authority. The Economist described the process. Every 10 minutes, each machine or group of machines involved in documenting and producing bitcoins takes a block of pending transactions and uses it as the input for a mathematical puzzle. The first to find a solution announces it to the rest, which check that it is right and that the transactions are valid. If a majority approve, the block is the block is cryptographically attached to the ledger, and the computers move on to a new set of transactions. Solving these mathematical problems also rewards the user with new bitcoins. This is what they mean by Bitcoin mining. But what may have begun as a libertarian's utopia and computer nerd's wet dream, in which individuals are able to homebrew their own money, has become a highly specialized and environmentally degrading industry. The numbers crunching power of computers mining bitcoins requires an enormous amount of electricity, more electricity per year than the whole of Ireland. I wonder how much electricity does Ireland actually use. Not saying that they don't have electricity, of course they do. Just interesting comparison. The Economist continued. Startups from all over the world began building specialized hardware powered by custom-built chips known as application-specific integrated circuits, or ASICs. No, ASICs. Yeah. Leaving the amateurs behind, these firms soon became locked in a digital arms race. Microprocessors usually double their power every 18 months, a rhythm called Moore's Law. In the case of mining ASICs, I'll just call it ASICs. I don't know if that is right. What's up, bad boys? What's up, Carolina? Good to see you here. Appreciate your views and participation in the chat. Great. This doubling, in the case of mining ASICs, this doubling has occurred every 6 months. As a result, new mining computers, which each cost several $1,000s, have been becoming obsolete in a matter of months. And also, my freaking GPU is more expensive by the day. So I hope that eventually China will create the next 6090 RTX in like a fraction of the price of the NVIDIA cards. Please, Mr. Xi Jinping, make this possible. Continuing, the colossal infrastructure investments that have gone into mining and verifying Bitcoin make it unlikely that this cryptocurrency will suddenly disappear anytime soon, as does the promise of potentially huge payouts. Turning on light. Yeah, that's better. But it seems equally unlikely that Bitcoin will take off to become a currency that millions of people actually use, which is still the case. You can look at El Salvador and see, that it went absolutely miserably wrong. 10 years since its release, it is still accepted by a very small number of vendors, and most of its recorded transactions are speculative trades of the coins themselves, rather than purchases of merchandise. Analyst at Morgan Stanley recently wrote, Bitcoin acceptance is virtually zero and shrinking. Out of a group of 500 top online merchants, only 3 of those merchants accepted Bitcoin as of July 2017. In this sense, it plays a role more as an investment vehicle, something we'll discuss further in Chapter 7, than a currency. There are a few reasons why. First, for a currency to be of use to buyers or sellers, it needs to be stable enough to provide a reflection of value and price. This is also why currencies that go into an inflationary freefall, like the Argentinian peso in the 80s or the dollar in Zimbabwe in the 2000s, for instance, become useless. But in a span of 2.5 months between November 2017 and mid January of the following year, Bitcoin's value went from $5,500 to nearly $20,000 back down, $20,000 back down to $10,500. By the time this book goes to print, it will have doubtless experienced even greater highs and lows. Let's say you own a car dealership and are willing to accept Bitcoin for your cars. You accept a single Bitcoin for a car when it's worth 20,000, but in the next week, that Bitcoin is worth 10,000. In a sense, you have sold your car for half its intended cost. Of course, you could hold on to the Bitcoin you've earned, assuming or hoping that its value will rise again. But this is a risky venture, and again resembles speculative gambling more than the functions of day to day high volume market exchanges. A currency must also be relatively stable as a store of value. Recall our chairmaker, who, for the money she received for her chair, wanted to buy bread on 2 different days and save the rest to pay her rent. But if she saves her income in bitcoins, who knows whether they'll cover rent at the end of the month? On one hand, if it seems like the currency's value is dropping fast, she might be inclined to just get rid of the bitcoins as quickly as possible. On the other hand, if it seems like its price will continue to rise in the long run, she'll be more interested in holding on to them than spending, hoping for higher returns down the line. Lastly, both vendors and customers have to tolerate slow and costly transaction procedures in order to use bitcoins. Currently, Bitcoin protocols can process a handful of transactions per second globally. Compare this to conventional systems such as Visa, which can handle 10,000 per second. Currently, a low demand for Bitcoin by consumers means that there is not enough incentive for merchants to invest in Bitcoin infrastructure. Could this change in the future? It's possible, though in my opinion, unlikely. For the part for their part, mainstream economics experts understand about as much about Bitcoin's value as they do about other speculative bubbles. A senior reporter with the techie news source Ars Technica, for instance, had this analysis to share in December 2017. I think it's going to continue to be volatile. I think we'll probably go up more, but I don't know how much more. And then I think it will probably crash, but I don't know how much. How far down it will decline. What is clear is that whatever Bitcoin's libertarian roots, its outcome is an absurd spectacle only possible under capitalism. In 2015, The Economist reported a huge aircraft hangar in Boden in the northern Sweden, big enough to hold a dozen helicopters, is now packed with computers, 45,000 of them, each with a whirring fan to stop it overheating. The machines work ceaselessly, trying to solve fiendishly difficult mathematical puzzles. The solutions are, in themselves, unimportant, yet by solving the puzzles, the computers earn their owners a reward in Bitcoin, a digital cryptocurrency. Thus, a hangar which used to hold actual physical goods is now warehousing thousands of computers solving meaningless riddles at great environmental cost, for the purpose of producing nothing but fodder for risky gambles. The magic of capitalism is at it again. Well, that was the entire sidebar. So, and I found it pretty interesting. I enjoy a lot. I'm enjoying a lot this reading because I noticed that. I mean, she's obviously written this around. I think it was first published on 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And this is the 2020 edition, so definitely has some revisions. But I find it super fun to read because it is very it I mean she makes quite a good effort of bringing Marxist theory to certain contemporary economic phenomena like cryptocurrency, and I think it's just very. I mean, I think this was clear enough, right? In a sense that, um, like, it's something that is not the idea of Bitcoin was pretty attractive at first, and then it just got you know uh, prostituted. Uh, I don't know if that's a word, but yeah, just exploited into and assimilated into the capitalist logic of treating it as just trading money to buy more money, uh, and create more money to get more money, and then that same money traded for another kind of money, which is just currency exchange, um, and extremely volatile and risky. Um, but definitely, I would have loved to be 50 Cent at the start of Bitcoin, and then realizing years later that you had like a few million in your account just because you bought Bitcoin at its lowest point in time. Uh, Definitely would have loved that. But anyways, let's continue. We have price and currency, and then the conclusion. So we're close to the end. Um, yeah, actually, this was pretty short chapter. I was expecting it a little bit longer, like the other chapters, especially because this is quite a complex chapter in Capital. Anyways, price and currency. Price, Marx argued, is not the same thing as value. While value is determined by socially necessary labor time, prices tend to fluctuate above and below this value, and sometimes wildly so. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx presented a theoretical assumption in which prices and values coincide. He did so for the sake of unearthing the elemental dynamics of value. But this assumption has to do with his method of scientific inquiry and not his belief that price and value are the same. Confusion about Marx's method has been used to deny the validity of labor theory of value. Critics point out that the various examples in the concrete world in which prices clearly don't line up with the amount of labor time that has gone into producing a particular commodity. In fact, Marx argued that value merely finds expression through prices, but it does not do so in an immovable way. At its base, price is the ratio between a given quantity of a commodity and its equivalent in money. It would be futile to attempt to find the exact price equivalent of an hour's worth of labor time embodied in a commodity. Several processes take place between the time that labor imbued it with value and the time that a price tag is slapped on it. What are the factors that would change the price of a commodity? The most fundamental cause would be a change in the actual base value of a product. That is, if it took greater or lesser amount of time to produce that commodity. For instance, recent developments in chilling and condensing natural gas have made it possible to easily ship gas across oceans. Thus, the time associated with, and therefore the cost of, transporting natural gas has dropped, and along with it, the price of natural gas itself. But then there are other things that could cause a change in the price of a commodity, even if its base value remained the same. Firstly, the impact of supply and demand creates fluctuations in the price. If there is a glut of oil or gas in the energy market, companies will race to get rid of their products before they are left holding unsellable goods. To do so, they may drive down prices below their value to ensure that their goods and not their competitors are bought first. On the other hand, if oil fields dry up or political fallout against drilling shale reserves causes a scarcity of energy products, they can feel secure in being able to jack up the price above its real value. Price fluctuations react to short-term changes in supply and demand for oil or gas or cars or newspapers or anything else. But as prices undulate up and down, they average out to a base value and make it clearer where the range of equilibrium lies, its natural price, as mainstream economists call it. As David Hardy explains, on a given day, price fluctuations will tell you the state of demand and supply for shoes on that day and why it has gone up or down from yesterday. The fact that we put money names on commodities and convert the measure of value into price form allows price fluctuations to equilibrate the market, and this brings us closer to identifying a proper representation of value as equilibrium of natural price. The rise and fall of prices allow for flexibility and fluidity in the determination of value, and in this way, allow society to reallocate resources in response to market changes. The process also forces more complex, longer-term adjustments of prices, which we will explore in future chapters. In short, capital flows to more profitable industries from less profitable ones. This process tends to increase supplies of commodities in profitable industries, thereby lowering prices and decreasing supplies in the less profitable ones, thereby raising prices. The end result is an overall equalization in profits in a way that distorts the base value of goods. Finally, the price of a commodity is also determined by the value of money itself. Marx explained in Value, Price, and Profit that the values of necessaries might remain the same, but a change might occur in their money prices consequent upon a previous change in the value of money. Nothing would have changed except the money names of those values. That is to say, a change in the exchange value of a particular currency does not change the value imbued in a commodity, but it will change the price. Right? So if, the let's say the peso goes down drastically, and that affects the prices of fruits, vegetables, food, commodities, but that does not mean that the value of food has changed, right? Value of food is still, depending on the socially necessary labor time. The socially necessary labor time is the same. So the only thing that changes is, the value of the currency itself, and that value of the currency itself affects the price of the commodities. Let's return to gold as an example. Its value, we've said, is determined by how much labor has gone into its discovery and production. If the amount of labor time that goes into producing gold drops in half, its value drops in half. So now, a share, instead of being worth 1 gold coin, it would be worth 2 gold coins, because each coin is worth half as much as it was before. But that doesn't mean that the value of the share changed. It just means that the same value is now represented by 2 gold coins versus 1. The price may have doubled, but so too have the prices of every other commodity, so its value relative to other commodities is still the same. It's easy to see how a gold coin can change in value since it has a base value to begin with. Yet the same principles apply to the more abstract currencies of today, as David Harvey explains. Gold, recall, is simply depicted by Marx as a representation of value, of socially necessary labor time. All that has happened since 1973 is that the manner of representation has changed. But Marx himself also notes multiple shifts in representational forms with coins, paper money, credit, and the like. So, in a way, there is nothing in the current situation that defies its mode of analysis. What has happened, in effect, is that the value of particular currency vis a vis all other currencies, or should be, determined is vis-a-vis all other currencies is or should be determined in terms of the value of the total bundle of commodities produced within a national economy. Money, whether it be counted in gold, dollars, or yuans, is a universal equivalent. One coin may have equaled one chair, 10 loaves of bread, one coat, and 20 yards of linen. Now it only equals half a chair, but this exchange in the coin's value means that it also equals 5 loaves of bread and 10 yards of linen, and so on. 16th century Italian economist Bernardo Davanzati, I hope I butchered that properly, explained this same principle through the words of a peasant who sold eggs. As money was brought down from 12 to 1, so the prices of things were raised from 1 to 12. In short, we would have inflation. Each monetary unit can buy less goods than it used to. In theory, inflation could also drive up the price of labor power, so while the cost of goods have gone up, so have the wages to buy them. Values relative to each other would then remain the same. In practice, however, wages have not kept up with inflation in the United States for the last few decades, and also in Mexico, by the way, even though there have been significant efforts to make up for that in the past two presidencies. Just another way that bosses can effectively reduce our wages without it seeming like we are taking a pay cut in dollars per hour. Changes in the value of currencies also occur unevenly around the world, which means that if, for instance, the value of the dollar drops but the value of the Japanese yen does not, then imports of many commonly used goods will be more expensive for working class people. And of course, if you're lucky enough to have any savings, the dollars that you have in the bank will now be worth half as much as they were before their value dropped. To sum up, there are several complex processes that stand between value and price. But as Marx explained, they work together in a way that supports rather than detracts from our understanding of the labor theory of value. The possibility, therefore, of a quantitative incongruity between and magnitude of value, i.e., the possibility that the price may diverge from the magnitude of value, is inherent in the price form itself. This is not a defect, but on the contrary, it makes this form the adequate one for a mode of production whose laws can only assert themselves as blindly operating averages between constant irregularities. Conclusion. Water break. There is a lot more to say about currencies and economic policy, but the important point to stress here is that while it is tempting to get hung up on fluctuations in currencies and their impact on prices, indeed, this is the focus of much of mainstream economics, the deeper question lies in the determination of the values of commodities, a value which money merely reflects. Ultimately, the only way to change the value of the chair is through reducing or increasing the amount of labor time that goes into making it. The relationship between values, from chairs to cars to wages, determines the economic conditions of our everyday lives. E.g., example given, the relationship between our wages and the necessities we need to buy. Money expresses these value relationships within the economy and creates a hierarchy of Dom Perignon champagnes to simple Proseccos and KitchenAid mixers to wire whisks. Yet the unquestioned authority that society bestows unto money masks the social relationships that determine these underlying values. With this understanding of value and money in mind, we'll next look at the special properties of money has for the capitalists and how money becomes more money in their hands. And the next chapter would be, where do profits come from? I'm enjoying this a lot, honestly. I think that it really simplifies a lot, but it's not a critique. Like I'm not saying that it's bad. I think it really does make it very accessible. I think maybe Marx might have even enjoyed this. The next chapter is actually quite long. I think she definitely is going to make up for the lack of pages for this particular chapter. Let's see, how many pages was this? So this is from 49 to 67, which is like 18 pages. And then 69 to, Jesus, yeah, to 101. So it's like, yeah, basically 39, I think. No, it's a little bit less, but yeah, it feels hefty. Yeah, but definitely this time it was like an hour and a half. Previous streams were like a couple of hours. Yeah, let me know what you think, guys. Did you enjoy the reading? Honestly, as I said before, I really did enjoy this. The clarity, I appreciate the clarity as a non-intellectual myself. I appreciate the clarity of when you know, critical theorists or, you know, economists try to make their ideas understood with extreme clarity. And yeah, Hadas Thier is fantastic in doing so, in bringing down, you know, Marx Capital into our current circumstances. I really enjoy this a lot. Yeah, great. So hopefully now this weekend we had, well, initially we were planning to have one of our comrades to give a class of, let me just get the book. So this is the book that our friend, colleague, and part of the Marxicans collective is working on in summarizing in a class, which is it's in Spanish, obviously, as you can see it. It's Los conceptos elementales del materialismo histórico, which means the elemental Elementary Concepts of Historical Materialism from Marta Harnecker. And yeah, he's preparing class about this. It's a pretty, I think it's a pretty hefty book, but in the same way, um, as as Conrad has said before, I haven't read it, by the way. I just have here because aura farming. Yeah, she was actually, yeah. So Marta Harnecker was a disciple of Louis Althusser in the École Normale from Paris, and she has published a few other books like The Capital, Fundamental Concepts, Cuba, Dictatorship or Democracy, The Revolution, The Social Revolution, Lenin and Latin America and Students, Christians and Indigenous in the Revolution. Yeah. So, oh yeah, as I was saying, so we're planning for a class this Saturday. Obviously, we will not be able to do that because, as I said at the beginning of the stream, I'll be on Mexico City, listening to the Instituto 17, the 17th Institute of Critical Theory, which is let's see. Yeah, just want to share the link to the site. So it is an institute focused on critical theory. So it's basically like a vanguard in the institute for vanguard intellectuals, which I would definitely recommend you guys check out. Most of them, and I mean like probably 80% of the courses are in Spanish. And I mean the content itself, the one that you actually read. There's possibly, I mean, I don't know. I haven't taken like all of them, obviously, but what I've taken, like only a few readings, texts were in English. Others were actually in French, so I had to open them in a browser and Google Translate them. But it's definitely something that might be relevant to any of you guys that want to check out. I'll also share the YouTube link right now because they are transmitting. Wait, oh yeah, it just ended. So I'm thinking that tomorrow they will continue. Let's see, program. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so one was today they would talk about eugenics, the rise of eugenics, and then they were talking about the genocide and how do you define a genocide in the context of the Gaza Israeli genocide, and also talking about neoliberalism. So definitely super interesting. I would definitely let you guys check it out. I'll share the link to their YouTube channel on the streams. Yeah, there it is. And yeah, so I think we can finish the stream right here. So I thank everyone that joined. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. We'll see each other next week on Wednesday. I will continue with the 4th chapter that is about, as I said, where the profits come from. Yeah, so there are 7 chapters and a conclusion with an afterword. And yeah, so we're missing where the profits come from, the accumulation of capital, capitalist crises, credit and financialization, and capitalism's gravediggers as a conclusion, with the afterword, the coronavirus crises, and her acknowledgements, and some lists about further reading, glossary, blah blah blah. So great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining, and we will see you on the flip side.